Her manager mocked her for pumping breast milk, threatened her job, made her cry into the break room's sink. But the Vampire King was touring the building for acquisition and caught the scent of a nursing mother's despair. It triggered memories of his lost family. He signed the purchase order in her tears. Elena Torres stood at the break room sink at precisely 2:47 in the afternoon, her hands trembling as she scrubbed the plastic flanges of her breast pump under water that ran too hot and then too cold because the faucet had been broken for 3 weeks, and nobody cared enough to fix it. The fluorescent lights above her head buzzed with that particular frequency that made her teeth ache, a sound she had learned to ignore during her 6 months as a rising marketing analyst at Technova Inc., back when she had a future here, back before everything fell apart in stages like a building collapsing floor by floor. 6 months ago, she had been on track for senior analyst, her supervisor mentioning her name in strategy meetings, her ideas making it into client presentations with her name attached. 3 months ago, she had given birth to Mia in a hospital room where the nurses kept congratulating her, and she kept smiling, even though her husband sat in the corner, scrolling through his phone with an expression she had never seen before, distant and cold, already gone, even though his body remained. 2 weeks ago, she had come home from her first day back at work to find the apartment emptier than it should have been. Closets with gaps, drawers pulled open, and a note on the kitchen counter that said sorry in handwriting that looked nothing like remorse. And when she checked their joint account, the number was 0, every dollar gone. Her savings, the emergency fund, the money her mother had given them for the baby, all of it vanished with a man who had promised forever and delivered 6 years. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Yesterday, her manager Richard Kendrick had walked past her in the hallway as she carried her pump bag to the break room and said loud enough for the entire open office to hear that pumping breast milk was a distraction to real workers, that maybe she should consider whether she was really committed to her career, that choices had consequences. Now she stood with soap residue mixing with her tears as she washed the pieces of the pump that connected to her body in the most intimate way, reducing her to a function, to a thing that produced milk for a 3-month-old daughter with a heart murmur the doctors called a condition and the insurance company called a pre-existing circumstance requiring additional documentation. The chemical smell of the industrial sanitizer they used in the break room filled her nose and throat, making her want to gag, but she swallowed it down the way she swallowed everything now. The humiliation, the exhaustion, the fear that scraped at her insides every time she looked at Mia sleeping in her crib and wondered how she would pay for the specialist appointments, the tests, the surgery that might be necessary if the murmur did not resolve on its own. Through the glass wall of the break room, she could see the open office beyond, 20 pairs of eyes that glanced her way and then looked away quickly. Co-workers who had been friendly once, who had invited her to happy hours and asked about her pregnancy, who now treated her like she carried some contagious disease called motherhood that might infect them if they got too close. The cold porcelain of the sink pressed against her palms as she leaned forward, trying to hold herself together, trying to finish this task so she could get back to her desk, but her hands would not stop shaking. The break room door swung open, and Richard Kendrick walked in with that particular smile he wore when he wanted to remind her of exactly how powerless she was, his eyes going immediately to her pump bag on the counter, the clear bottles still attached, the evidence of what she was and what she needed laid out for him to judge. Again, he said, his voice carrying that false surprise that was really contempt wrapped in a question mark. "You are billing the company for this hobby?" His voice was not loud, but it did not need to be. The break room opened directly onto the office floor, and his words carried through the glass, bouncing off surfaces, reaching ears that would repeat them later in whispered conversations by the coffee machine. Elena felt her face flush hot and then cold, felt the tears that had been threatening all day press harder against the backs of her eyes. But she would not cry, not in front of him, Not again. She could quit, walk out right now, let him find someone else to mock. But Mia needed insurance. The heart condition meant she could not go uninsured for even a month, could not risk the gap in coverage that would make every future policy more expensive or impossible to get. And Richard knew this, had known it since the day Elena came back from maternity leave, and he had made a point of asking about Mia's health in a tone that sounded concerned but felt like a threat. She swallowed the words she wanted to say, swallowed her pride, her anger, her sense of self, and nodded, her voice coming out as a whisper that barely qualified as sound. "I will make up the time." Richard's smile widened, and she saw the satisfaction in his eyes, the pleasure he took in her submission, in forcing her to bend. "You will make it up now," he said, his tone shifting to something almost cheerful. Presentation is moved to 3 p.m., 15 minutes. He knew she had not prepared, knew she had been in this break room pumping while he had sent the email changing the meeting time, knew she would walk into that conference room unprepared and fail, and failing would give him exactly the justification he needed to push her out without technically firing her, without triggering unemployment, without leaving any evidence that he had done anything wrong. Elena's phone buzzed in her pocket, the vibration loud against her hip, and she pulled it out with numb fingers to see the daycare number on the screen, the same daycare that only called when something was wrong, when Mia's fever spiked, or she would not stop crying, or the heart murmur caused some new symptom that required a parent to come immediately. Richard saw the phone, saw the number, saw Elena's face go pale, and his smile became something else entirely, something that looked like joy. "Problem?" he asked, and walked out of the break room, leaving her standing there with her pump parts dripping into the sink, and her phone buzzing, and her entire life collapsing around her in real time. 40 floors below the break room where Elena Torres stood crying into a sink, Lucian Thorne stepped out of an armored car into the underground garage of the Technova building, his shoes clicking against concrete that still smelled of morning rain. Even though no rain had fallen here in 3 days, the scent carried down through ventilation shafts from the world above. He was 873 years old, though he looked perhaps 35 to human eyes, his face arranged in the particular expression of calculated neutrality he had perfected over centuries of negotiations, acquisitions, the bloodless warfare of modern business that replaced the actual blood warfare of his youth. Vampire King of the Eastern Seaboard, a title that meant power and responsibility in equal measure, the weight of territories and populations, and ancient laws that predated the country he now called home. He wore a charcoal suit tailored in Milan by a man whose grandfather had tailored suits for Lucian in 1952, the fabric so fine it felt like water against his skin, the cost more than Richard Kendrick's car, and probably his annual salary combined, though Lucien had not thought about cost in 2 centuries, because money, like time, became meaningless when you had infinite quantities of both. His objective today was simple, routine, the kind of business his CFO Isadora usually handled without bothering him. Acquire Technova Inc. for its satellite surveillance patents, fold it into his portfolio of technology companies, extract value, move on. "Boring," he had told Isadora that morning over a breakfast of warmed blood in crystal glasses, her expression agreeing with him in that wordless way they had developed over 600 years of working together. The private elevator rose through the building's core, glass and steel, and the hum of expensive machinery, and Lucian stood with his hands in his pockets thinking about the evening's council meeting, the territorial dispute in Connecticut, the endless bureaucracy of vampire politics, when the scent hit him like a physical blow. Salt, copper, milk, despair, a combination he had not encountered in 400 years. Not since Marguerite had wept in their stone manor in France, her body producing milk for a baby who could not drink it, their daughter Isabeau growing grayer and weaker because no wet nurse in the village would feed a vampire's child, because they feared contamination, damnation, because superstition mattered more than an infant's life. The memory rose so fast and sharp it felt like being stabbed. Marguerite's face twisted with grief and rage, screaming at him that this was his fault, his curse, his darkness infecting their child, and he had stood there useless, a king with armies at his command who could not save one tiny girl from starvation. His hand shot out without conscious thought and crushed the elevator's brass railing, the metal screaming as it deformed under his grip, and Isadora, ice-blonde and 600 years old and unshakable in every crisis he had ever seen her face, raised one perfect eyebrow. "My lord," she said, her tone carefully neutral, the question implicit. "Find the source," Lucien said, his voice dropping to the register he had used to command armies in wars whose names were now footnotes in history books, the tone that meant he was not asking. Now. Isadora pulled her tablet from her leather briefcase, and her fingers moved across the screen with inhuman speed, accessing building schematics, tracing ventilation systems, following the scent trail through ducts and shafts that carried air from one floor to another. 14th floor, she said after a moment, her eyes still on the screen. Break room. Occupied by, she paused, and Lucian saw something flicker across her face, surprise or recognition, or perhaps concern, one human female, elevated cortisol, lactating. The elevator was still rising and Lucian reached out and pressed the button for the 14th floor, canceling the acquisition meeting scheduled on the top floor, ignoring Isadora's slight intake of breath that meant she thought he was making a mistake, but would not say so. "Bring me to her floor," he said, quietly. Elena stood in conference room B with her laptop connected to the projector that flickered every 30 seconds like it might die completely. 5 executives arranged around the table watching her with expressions ranging from bored to hostile. Richard Kendrick at the head of the table with his arms crossed, and that smile on his face, the one that said he already knew how this would end. She had not slept in 30 hours, had been up all night with Mia, who would not stop crying, some instinct in her infant body sensing her mother's fear and reflecting it back in wails that cut through the thin walls of their apartment. And now Elena's eyes felt full of sand, her thoughts moving through mud, her breasts aching because she was overdue to pump and her body did not care about presentations or career or any of the things that used to matter. The slides on the screen were half finished, bullet points that went nowhere, data she had not had time to analyze, her proposal for the new marketing campaign looking exactly like what it was, the work of someone drowning who kept getting pushed under every time she tried to surface. Richard leaned back in his chair with an expression of fake pleasantness that made her stomach turn. "Elena has been—" He paused as if searching for the right word, though they both knew he had chosen it already, "preoccupied lately. Let us see if motherhood has sharpened or dulled her strategic thinking." 2 of the executives laughed, sharp barks of sound that felt like slaps, while the others sat in uncomfortable silence, their eyes sliding away from her face, unwilling to intervene, unwilling to make themselves targets by defending her. Elena clicked to the next slide and tried to explain her reasoning, tried to sound confident and competent, but her voice shook and she could hear it shaking, and everyone in the room could hear it too. Mid-sentence her milk let down, her body betraying her in the worst possible moment. 2 wet spots blooming across the front of her blouse like stigmata, visible proof of her failure to separate her body from her work. And Richard's smile sharpened into something that looked like victory. "Perhaps you should have planned better," he said softly, and the executives who had laughed before laughed again. Elena stood there for 3 seconds, 5 seconds, feeling the wet fabric against her skin, feeling 28 years of trying to do everything right dissolve into this single moment of public humiliation, and something inside her that had been bending finally snapped. She closed the laptop with a click that sounded loud in the quiet room, stood up straight, smoothed her skirt with hands that had stopped shaking because there was nothing left to lose. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but steady, each word clear and deliberate. "I resign." Richard's expression shifted. Surprise followed immediately by calculation. and he leaned forward with his elbows on the table. "You cannot," he said, his tone almost gentle, almost kind, the way a cat sounds purr before it bites. "You signed a non-compete. You leave now. You cannot work in marketing for 2 years. Good luck paying for—" He paused again, pretending to remember. What was it? Your daughter's heart surgery? Through the glass conference room wall, Elena saw a figure in the hallway, tall and utterly still in a way that human bodies were never still, watching through the glass with eyes that caught the fluorescent light wrong, reflecting it back amber and bright. Predator eyes, and her hindbrain screamed danger, even as her conscious mind tried to process what she was seeing. The conference room door opened, though no one had knocked, and the man stepped inside, charcoal suit, dark hair. A face that was beautiful, in the way that poisonous things are beautiful, arresting and terrible, and every person in the room felt their bodies respond with ancient fear, muscles tensing, breath catching, the part of their brain that remembered being prey lighting up like wildfire. His gaze moved across the room and found Elena, and held, amber eyes meeting her dark brown ones, and she could not look away, could not breathe, could not think. "Meeting is over," he said, his voice soft and absolute. "Leave." Richard stood up, his face flushing red, puffing himself up with false authority, with the power he thought his title gave him. "Excuse me, who the hell?" But he did not finish the sentence because Lucien turned his head and smiled, and there was something in that smile older than language, older than civilization. A promise of violence that predated words, and Richard's voice died in his throat, and every executive in the room stood and walked out without a word, leaving Elena alone with a vampire king who had bought a company because he heard her cry. The woman who walked into the hospital waiting room 2 hours after Mia had been admitted wore a gray suit that looked like it cost more than Elena's entire wardrobe, her posture so straight it seemed architectural, engineered, a column of authority that made everyone in the room sit up straighter without knowing why. She was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark skin and silver hair cut short against her skull, her face arranged in an expression of perfect neutrality that somehow managed to convey absolute judgment, and when her eyes found Lucien, sitting 3 seats away from Elena, something passed between them that felt like recognition and challenge combined. "Cassandra Vex," she said, her voice carrying the particular cadence of someone who had spoken a dozen dead languages and watched empires rise and fall. "Council Arbiter for Human-Vampire Relations. 1,200 years old, though she looked perhaps 40. Her age evident only in the way she held herself, the stillness that came from having outlived everything she had ever loved. Her job, as she explained while pulling a silver tablet from her briefcase, was to ensure vampires did not break the Treaty of Montreal, signed in 2001 after a series of incidents that had nearly exposed their existence to the human world. A treaty that prohibited compelling humans, public feeding, using wealth to create what the council delicately called thrall harems, collections of dependent humans bound by gratitude and fear and the subtle manipulation of vampire influence. She stood in the center of the waiting room and looked at Lucien with eyes that had seen centuries of vampire excess and human suffering, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of ancient law. "Lord Thorne, you purchased a human company within hours of meeting a lactating employee. You have installed her in executive housing. You are paying her child's medical bills. This has the appearance of thrall binding." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, visible and choking, and Elena felt her stomach drop, because suddenly, everything that had seemed like rescue looked like something else entirely, looked like the setup for a trap she had walked into willingly. Lucien stood, his movements fluid and controlled, his face shifting into an expression Elena had not seen before, cold and regal, the vampire king rather than the man who had crushed a brass railing because he smelled her despair. "I have not bitten her," he said, his voice ice over stone. "Have not offered her my blood, have not signed her to any contract. Which treaty clause am I violating?" Cassandra's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes, acknowledgement that he was technically correct, legally protected, but also something else, disappointment perhaps, or long experience with vampires who followed the letter of the law while violating its spirit. "The spirit of the law," she said, her tone allowing no argument. "You have made her dependent on you." Financially coerced gratitude that could lead to, but she did not finish because Elena had heard enough. "Excuse me," Elena said, standing up on legs that shook but held, her voice coming out stronger than she felt. "I am right here, and I am not anyone's thrall." The words felt dangerous in her mouth, challenging a 1,200-year-old vampire who could probably kill her without thinking. But anger burned hotter than fear, anger at being talked about like she was an object, a possession, a thing without agency or choice. "He helped me because my boss was abusing his power," she continued, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "That is not illegal, even in your world." Cassandra turned to look at her fully for the first time, really look at her, and Elena felt the weight of that gaze, felt herself being assessed and measured and judged by something vastly older and more powerful than anything she had ever encountered. "Miss Torres," Cassandra said, her tone shifting slightly, becoming almost gentle, which somehow made it more frightening. "Do you feel free to leave Lord Thorne's employ?" It was a test, Elena understood immediately, a question designed to reveal the truth beneath whatever lies people told themselves, because if she hesitated, if she showed even a moment of doubt or fear or compulsion, the council could intervene, could remove her from Lucian's influence, could decide her fate without consulting her. She thought of Mia in the hospital room down the hall, tiny body hooked to monitors, breathing steadily now after hours of crisis. Thought of Richard Kendrick's smile as he threatened her job. Thought of Lucian sitting 3 seats away in the waiting room, close enough to help but far enough to give her space, respecting her boundaries even when he did not have to. "I am free," she said clearly, looking Cassandra directly in the eyes. "I choose to stay, at least until I understand what is happening." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a verdict, the courtroom hush before the judge speaks, and Elena held her breath wondering if she had said the right thing or doomed herself. "Very well," Cassandra said finally, reaching into her briefcase and pulling out a silver card that she handed to Lucian with deliberate care. "But Lord Thorne, you will submit to monitoring, weekly reports, any sign of compulsion, and the council will remove her from your influence, permanently." The threat was clear and absolute, no room for negotiation, no second chances, and Lucian took the card with a slight inclination of his head that might have been respect or acknowledgement or simply political necessity. "Agreed," he said, his eyes moving to Elena. Provided Ms. Torres consents to the monitoring, he was deferring to her, giving her the choice, a subtle shift of power that Cassandra noticed based on the way her eyebrow raised fractionally, and Elena understood that she had leverage now, that whatever this arrangement was, she was not powerless in it. "I consent," Elena said, because what else could she say? Because she needed the protection and the job and the medical coverage for Mia, because walking away meant going back to nothing. Cassandra left without another word, her departure as dramatic as her arrival, and when she was gone, the waiting room felt suddenly smaller, the air easier to breathe. Lucian turned to Elena, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked uncertain. "I should have warned you," he said quietly. "My world has rules that will complicate yours." The doctor came 2 hours later with news that Mia would be fine, the fever broken, the infection responding to antibiotics, home in 2 days, and Elena cried in the hospital bathroom with her hands braced against the sink, relief and exhaustion pouring out of her, in sobs she muffled against her palms. When she finally looked up at the mirror, she saw herself clearly for the first time in weeks. 28 years old, alone, broke, with a sick daughter and a vampire king offering protection she did not fully understand. Why was he really doing this? The question circled in her mind like water down a drain. pulling her thoughts down into darkness, and she washed her face with cold water and walked out into the hallway to find answers. Lucian was standing exactly where she had left him, staring out a window that showed nothing but darkness and distant city lights. And when she approached, he turned with that preternatural awareness vampires had, knowing she was there before she made a sound. "Tell me the truth," she said without preamble. "All of it. Why you really bought the company?" He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, the mask of control cracking just slightly, and he gestured toward the hospital chapel at the end of the hall. They walked in silence, and the chapel was deserted, rows of empty chairs facing a simple altar, non-denominational and sterile. And Elena noticed that Lucian crossed the threshold without hesitation. Another myth debunked, vampires and holy ground apparently compatible. They sat in the back row, and he stared at his hands, turning them over as if looking for something written on his palms. And when he spoke, his voice was different, softer, carrying the weight of centuries. "I had a wife once," he said. "Marguerite. In France, in 1621. We had a daughter. Isabeau. She lived 4 days. The story came out in fragments, pieces of old pain arranged like broken glass, beautiful and sharp, cutting both of them as he spoke. Marguerite had been human when they married, had known what he was and loved him anyway, had wanted a child desperately. And when Isabeau was born, the baby had been perfect, tiny and pink and screaming with life. But no wet nurse would feed a vampire's child, superstition and fear stronger than compassion, and Marguerite's own milk had not been enough, her body weak from childbirth. And they had watched their daughter starve over 4 days, growing grayer and quieter until she simply stopped breathing. Marguerite had screamed at him, blamed him, said his darkness had killed their child, and she had died herself 3 months later. Grief or infection or simply giving up, he had never known which. "For 400 years I have watched human mothers and children from a distance," Lucian continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "unable to help without breaking laws designed to prevent vampires from collecting humans like possessions. In my time, a king could claim droit de seigneur, the right to protect any woman in his lands. It was law, sacred. Now the council calls it thrall binding. But when I heard you cry," he stopped, his jaw working, started again. "Every instinct I have, older than the council, older than their treaties, said protect her. So I did." Elena sat very still, processing this, understanding clicking into place like puzzle pieces finding their proper positions. "You do not want to control me," she said, and it was not a question. "You want to atone." Lucian turned to look at her, and his eyes were entirely human in that moment, full of old grief and desperate hope. "I cannot bring them back," he said. "But I can make sure no mother in my reach suffers what Marguerite did, even if the council punishes me for it." The vulnerability in his voice was shocking, a creature of immense power reduced to this simple need, to fix what could not be fixed, to save someone even though he could not save the ones he had lost. Elena made a decision then, sitting in that sterile chapel with a vampire king who had lost everything that mattered, a decision that felt both reckless and absolutely right. "Then we do this right," she said firmly. "Legal. I will work for your company. Actually work, not just take charity. You get your protection instinct satisfied. I get safety for Mia. The council gets transparency. Everyone wins." Lucian looked at her with something like wonder. "You would trust me? After today?" Elena smiled, tired and honest. "You stayed 3 seats away in the waiting room. A predator who respects boundaries?" "Yeah, I trust you. For now." The qualifier was important, a reminder that trust was earned continuously, not given once and forgotten. And she saw him understand this, saw respect in his eyes. He pulled out his phone and dialed, and Isadora's voice came through crisp and professional. "Draft an employment contract," he said without preamble. Ms. Torres, Senior VP of Human Resources, salary market rate plus 20%, medical coverage unlimited. She reports to the board, not me. Send it tonight. He ended the call and extended his hand to Elena, formal, a business arrangement, and she took it, their palms meeting, skin on skin for the first time. For 1 second his eyes flashed full amber, inhuman and predatory, his hand tightening around hers with strength that could crush bone, and then he released her and stepped back, breathing carefully, deliberately. I should go, he said, his voice rough. Sunrise is in 3 hours. Elena felt suddenly curious, emboldened by the honesty they had shared. Does it really burn you? Yes, Lucienne said, backing toward the chapel door. But that is not why I am leaving. You smell like milk and warmth and life, and I am very, very hungry. He was gone before she could respond, vampire speed taking him down the hallway faster than human eyes could follow, leaving her alone in the chapel with her hands still tingling from his touch, and the understanding that whatever they had started tonight was far more dangerous and complicated than either of them had admitted. 2 weeks had passed since the hospital chapel conversation, and Elena had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, working from the executive floor office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and door that locked with her fingerprint, Mia healthy and thriving at a new daycare that did not blink at her insurance coverage, Richard Kendrick transferred to a Thorne subsidiary in Alaska, where he apparently spent his days cleaning vampire offices at 3 in the morning, Isadora's particular brand of humor evident in the assignment. Everything had stabilized into something manageable, Elena working 80-hour weeks to prove she had earned her position, restructuring benefits packages for 2,000 employees, creating new parental leave policies that actual parents had helped design. And she was good at this work, better than she had expected, her ideas sharp, and her execution flawless. Then the article dropped on a Tuesday morning, published by a business journalist with a reputation for exposés that destroyed careers. The headline reading, Vampire Billionaire's New VP, Single Mother, He Met During Corporate Raid, Council Investigates Possible Thrall Scandal, and Elena's stomach turned to ice as she read the first paragraph on her phone while sitting at her desk with coffee going cold in her hand. The article included photos she had not known existed, images of Lucian and her leaving the hospital 2 weeks ago, him opening a car door for her with that old-fashioned courtesy that looked like ownership through the camera's lens, her carrying Mia with her face exhausted and vulnerable, and the optics were damning in ways she had not anticipated, every gesture of kindness transformed into evidence of manipulation. By noon, the story had spread across every major news outlet, headlines screaming Vampire King's new pet? And is this protection or possession? Opinion pieces debating whether Elena was a victim or a gold digger, whether Lucian was a hero or a predator, whether the council should intervene, or whether this was just another example of vampire excess that humans tolerated because they had no choice. Elena's phone would not stop ringing, reporters somehow getting her number, asking for comments, asking if she was scared, asking if she loved him, questions that assumed answers she had not figured out herself. Her apartment building's lobby filled with cameras and microphones, people shouting questions as she tried to leave for work. And she ended up calling in sick for the first time since starting at Technova, hiding in her apartment with the curtains drawn while Mia played on the floor, blissfully unaware that her mother's life was imploding in real time. Her mother called from Arizona at 2 in the afternoon, voice high and panicked, in that particular way that meant she had been watching too much news and working herself into a state. Mija, what have you done? Vampires? Are you insane? Elena tried to explain. Tried to make her mother understand that Lucian had helped her when no one else would, that she had earned her position, that this was not what the articles made it seem. But her mother's fear was louder than reason, 4 decades of vampire prejudice and old superstitions drowning out Elena's attempts at calm explanation. He will kill you, her mother said, voice breaking. Or worse, he will keep you, and you will forget who you are, forget your family, Forget everything but him. That is what they do, Mija. That is what vampires do. Elena ended the call feeling hollow and angry, angry at the journalist who had turned her life into entertainment, angry at her mother for not trusting her judgment, angry at herself for not seeing this coming. Lucian sent security within the hour. Professional men and women in dark suits who cleared the reporters from her building's lobby with quiet efficiency. No violence but an unmistakable threat in their presence. And then he called her directly, his voice careful and controlled. "I can offer you the penthouse in my building," he said. "Secure, private, you would have your own floor." Elena's immediate response was refusal, sharp and automatic. "That would look like exactly what they are accusing us of," she said, pacing her small living room with Mia watching her with wide eyes. "Moving into your building, accepting your protection that visibly, it would prove their point." The silence on the other end of the line felt heavy, and when Lucian spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been respect, or sadness, or both. "You are right," he said simply. "I will keep security on your building. Nothing more. Unless you ask." The professional cost became clear the next morning when Elena returned to work and found an email from 3 board members, all human, all calling for her removal as senior VP, their language diplomatic but their meaning brutal. "Conflict of interest," they wrote. "She is clearly compromised, unable to make objective decisions. Her presence damages the company's reputation." Elena read the email 3 times, each reading making her angrier, making her more determined to prove them wrong. And when Isadora knocked on her office door an hour later, Elena was ready for a fight. Isadora entered with her usual grace, ice blonde hair perfect, expression unreadable, and she closed the door behind her before speaking. "The council's overseer arrives tomorrow," she said without preamble. "Her name is Seraphine Cole, 1,500 years old." She sat in the chair across from Elena's desk, crossing her legs with precision. "If she finds one irregularity, one gift you have accepted, one favor you have asked, she will rule you are a thrall. They will relocate you, change your identity. You will never see Thorn again." The words landed like blows, and Elena felt her hands curl into fists on her desk. "I earned this position," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "I have been working 80-hour weeks. I have restructured benefits for 2,000 employees, and they think I am just some vampire's plaything?" Isadora's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been approval flickering in her ancient eyes. "Then prove them wrong," she said. "Tomorrow, in front of Seraphine." Elena nodded, jaw set, already planning what she would say, how she would demonstrate her competence, her independence, her absolute refusal to be dismissed as anything less than what she had earned. Isadora stood to leave but paused at the door. "For what it is worth," she said quietly, "I have worked with Lord Thorn for 600 years. I have never seen him defer to anyone the way he defers to you. That is not possession. That is respect." She left before Elena could respond, and Elena sat alone in her office staring at the city beyond her windows, wondering if respect would be enough to survive what was coming. Seraphine Cole arrived at 9 in the morning, and every vampire in the building felt her presence like a change in air pressure, something ancient and powerful walking among them, demanding acknowledgement. She was tall, over 6 feet, with dark skin and gold eyes that seemed to see through flesh to the truth beneath, ceremonial scars marking her face in patterns from an era before written history, when vampires carved their status into their skin with silver and pain. She wore modern clothes, a black suit that fit perfectly, but she moved like someone from another age, her bearing regal and absolute, and when Lucian met her in the lobby, he inclined his head in a gesture of deference Elena had never seen him make before. Seraphine outranked him in council hierarchy, older and more powerful, her authority absolute in matters of human-vampire relations, and she looked at him with eyes that had judged thousands before him and found most of them wanting. The examination began in Elena's office. Seraphine sending Lucian away with a gesture. Closing the door and sitting across from Elena with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. "Tell me about every interaction you have had with Lord Thorne," she said, her voice carrying the particular cadence of someone who spoke English as a 10th or 12th language, the accent impossible to place. Elena told her everything, starting with the break room, Richard's cruelty, Lucien's intervention, the hospital, the chapel conversation, the employment contract, every detail she could remember, and Seraphine listened without interruption, her gold eyes never leaving Elena's face. Then Seraphine pulled out a tablet and began reviewing Elena's bank accounts, transaction histories appearing on the screen with a thoroughness that should have been illegal but apparently was not when the council was involved. And Elena watched her scan every deposit, every withdrawal, looking for unexplained money, for gifts disguised as payments, for any evidence of financial manipulation. She found nothing because there was nothing to find. Elena's salary deposited like clockwork, her expenses normal, her savings account slowly rebuilding from zero. Seraphine reviewed Elena's work product next, pulling up reports and presentations and policy documents, reading with inhuman speed, and Elena saw something shift in her expression, a slight narrowing of the eyes that might have been surprise or approval. "This is good work," Seraphine said finally, looking up from the tablet. "Genuinely good. Not the work of someone performing a role to please a benefactor." Elena felt a flush of pride followed immediately by anger that she needed ancient vampire approval for work she knew was excellent. "If I ordered you to leave this company today, would you?" Seraphine asked, and the question was a test, obvious and unavoidable, and Elena took a breath before answering. "I would ask why," Elena said carefully. "Then I would decide. I am not anyone's property to order around. Not yours, not his." Seraphine smiled for the first time, a slight curve of lips that transformed her face from severe to almost warm. "Good," she said, "but I must still observe you together." The bond between vampire and human can form unconsciously, especially when the vampire is old and lonely. She stood and opened the office door, gesturing for Lucien to enter, and he came in with that careful neutrality he wore in council matters, sitting in the chair beside Elena's desk, while Seraphine took the chair across from them both, creating a triangle of observation. "Discuss your Q4 HR initiatives," Seraphine commanded, and Elena pulled up her presentation, talking Lucien through the proposed changes to parental leave, to flexible scheduling, to mental health coverage, her voice steady and professional. Lucien listened and then made a suggestion, his tone thoughtful. "What if we extended parental leave to 12 months? Make Technova the industry leader." Elena shook her head immediately. "Budget will not support it," she said. 6 months is feasible and still puts us ahead of competitors. 12 months would require cutting other benefits or raising costs, and employees prioritized mental health coverage over extended leave in the surveys. Lucien was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "You are right," he said. "I was not thinking like a VP. I was thinking like—" he paused, "someone else." Seraphine watched this exchange with those gold eyes that missed nothing, and then she asked the question Elena had been dreading. "Lord Thorne, why did you really buy this company?" Lucien could have lied, could have cited the patents, the strategic advantage, any number of business reasons, but instead he looked at Seraphine and said simply, "I heard her cry. I wanted to stop the crying." Seraphine's expression did not change. "And now?" Lucien turned to look at Elena, and his face was open in a way she had rarely seen, vulnerable and honest. "Now, I want her to succeed. On her terms." Seraphine pulled a silver blade from inside her jacket, the metal gleaming in the office light, and she looked at Elena. "Ms. Torres, hold out your hand." Elena did, confused and slightly afraid, and Seraphine took her hand with surprising gentleness and drew the blade across her palm, shallow but enough to break skin, blood welling red and bright against Elena's pale skin. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Every vampire in the building freezing wherever they were, 17 of them scattered across 14 floors, all of them smelling blood and maternal fear, and the particular cocktail of hormones that came from a nursing mother, and Lucian's eyes went full black, pupils blown wide, his body going rigid with control that looked like it hurt. He did not move, did not breathe, just gripped the arms of his chair with both hands until the wood cracked and splintered under his fingers. And Elena watched him fight himself, watched ancient instinct war with modern control, watched him win. Seraphine pulled out a silver paste from her pocket and spread it across Elena's cut, the wound healing instantly, skin knitting back together as if it had never been broken. And she looked at Lucian with something that might have been respect. "He has significant self-control," Seraphine said, her tone almost impressed. Impressive for one triggered by maternal instincts. She wiped the remaining blood from Elena's palm with a cloth, then stood and looked at them both. "You are not thralls. Yet. But Lord Thorn, your attachment is dangerous. For you both." She walked to the window, looking out at the city beyond. The old ways, droit de seigneur, protection bonds, they are forbidden because they always end the same. The vampire becomes obsessed, the human becomes dependent. When she dies, he goes mad. I have seen it 50 times. I will not see it again. The warning hung in the air like a curse, and Elena felt something cold settle in her chest, understanding for the first time the full scope of what they were risking. Seraphine left without another word, and Elena and Lucian sat in silence for a long moment, the cracked chair arms between them, the smell of blood still faint in the air. "Is that true?" Elena asked finally, her voice shaking. "You would go mad if I—" She could not finish the sentence, could not say the word died, could not make that future real by speaking it. Lucien turned to look at her, and his eyes were still black, still fighting for control. "I have been alone for 400 years, he said, his voice raw and honest. "I will not let myself need you that much." But his voice said he already did, said he was already too far gone, said they were both standing on the edge of something neither of them knew how to survive. Meanwhile, in Alaska, 3 time zones away and 2,000 miles north, Richard Kendrick stood in a vampire office building at 3 in the morning with a mop in his hands and rage burning in his chest like acid. He had been demoted from senior manager to custodian, from corner office to cleaning closets, from respect to humiliation, and his ego could not survive it, would not survive it, needed someone to blame and found that someone in Elena Torres, who had somehow seduced a vampire king and destroyed Richard's entire life in the process. He was freezing, miserable, cleaning floors that vampires walked across with their expensive shoes and their ancient arrogance, and he pulled out his phone and called the journalist who had written the first exposé, the one who had made Elena's life difficult but not impossible, and Richard offered something better. "I have an insider story," he said, his voice eager and vicious, "about Elena Torres, about how she really got her position." The journalist listened and Richard talked, spinning a story of seduction and manipulation, claiming Elena had faked her tears, used Mia as a prop, schemed her way into power by exploiting a vampire's weakness for maternal instinct, painting her as a calculating woman who had endangered the entire company with her needy mother act. He gave the journalist details, some true and most false, mixing enough reality with invention to make the lies believable, and when he hung up he felt satisfied for the first time in weeks. Felt like he had finally struck back at the woman who had ruined him. The article dropped 2 days later with a headline that made Elena's previous coverage look gentle. Vampire King's VP. Seductress or victim? Former colleague speaks out, and the content was vicious, accusing Elena of manipulation and fraud, questioning her competence and her motives, suggesting she had used her daughter's illness to trap a powerful vampire into supporting her, painting her as either a master manipulator or a helpless victim, but never as what she actually was, a competent professional doing her job. Elena read the article in her office at 11 at night, alone because she had been working late to prove herself, to demonstrate her worth to the board members calling for her removal, and the words hit her like physical blows, each accusation sharper than the last, each lie wrapped around a kernel of truth that made it impossible to dismiss entirely. She did not cry, she was too angry for tears, but her hands shook as she gripped her phone, reading the quotes attributed to Richard, his voice dripping with false concern and real malice. Lucien appeared at her office door 20 minutes later, knocking softly, and she knew he had been monitoring building security, knew the cameras had shown her still at her desk long after everyone else had gone home, knew he had come because he could not help himself. "May I?" he asked, and she nodded, too tired to send him away, too exhausted to maintain the professional distance they had been carefully preserving. He entered and read the article over her shoulder, his presence solid and cold behind her. And when he finished, she heard him take a breath. "This is slander," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. Elena turned to look at him and saw his eyes were black again, saw the predator barely leashed. "It does not matter if it is true," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "People will believe it. I will always be the woman who cried her way into a vampire's bed." Lucien's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Say the word," he said quietly. "I will destroy him, legally or otherwise." It was not a metaphor, Elena knew. He could ruin Richard in a dozen ways, could make him disappear, could end him. And the temptation to accept that offer was stronger than she wanted to admit. "No," she said, standing on legs that felt shaky but held. "That would prove them right, that I am just hiding behind your power." She walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "I will handle this my way." She turned back to face him, decision crystallizing. "I am calling a press conference. 24 hours. I will address everything publicly." Lucien's expression shifted to concern. "The council will not like you drawing attention," he started, but Elena cut him off. "I do not care what the council likes," she said, her voice hard with determination. "I care about the truth." Lucien looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face softened. "You are braver than I was," he said quietly, moving toward the door. "Marguerite would have liked you." It was the first time he had spoken his wife's name to anyone but Elena, the first time he had made that comparison, and Elena felt the weight of it, the trust it represented, the danger it implied. He left before she could respond, and she stood alone in her office planning exactly what she would say to the world, how she would take back her narrative, how she would prove that she was nobody's victim and nobody's puppet, just a woman who had earned her place and refused to apologize for surviving. The press conference took place in Technova's main lobby at 2 in the afternoon, Elena standing at a podium that felt both too high and too exposed. 50 reporters crowded into the space with cameras and microphones, creating a forest of technology pointed at her face. And somewhere above on the mezzanine, Lucien watched, visible but distant, a dark figure against the glass railing who had agreed to stay back unless she called for him. Elena had prepared for this, spent the previous night writing and rewriting her statement, practicing in front of her bathroom mirror while Mia slept, and now she stood with her notes in front of her, and her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine like ice. 3 weeks ago, she began, looking directly into the cameras, I was pumping breast milk in a break room sink because my manager mocked me for needing privacy. Today, I am a senior VP because a vampire king bought this company and gave me a chance to prove my worth. You want to call that seduction? I call it justice. The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward, reporters leaning forward with renewed interest. And Elena felt something shift in her chest, anger transforming into power, humiliation becoming fuel. She pulled up the first document on the screen behind her. Emails from Richard Kendrick that she had saved, had documented, had kept as evidence even when she thought no one would ever care. Here are HR complaints I filed that were ignored, she said, reading the dates and timestamps aloud. Here are meeting invitations scheduled deliberately during my pumping times. Here is a written threat about my non-compete clause, sent the day I tried to resign. She let the evidence speak for itself. Let the reporters see the pattern of abuse, the systematic cruelty disguised as management, and she watched their expressions change from skepticism to something harder, something that looked like recognition. Then she pulled up her own work, the HR restructuring she had led in 3 weeks, employee satisfaction scores up 34%, 3 major clients she had personally retained during the acquisition transition, her documentation thorough and professional, and impossible to dismiss as anything other than competent. "This is what I have done in 3 weeks," she said, her voice ringing clear across the lobby. "Judge me on that." A reporter near the front raised her hand, middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a recorder held high. "But is it not suspicious that Lord Thorne, a vampire known for avoiding the spotlight, suddenly became your benefactor?" The question was fair, Elena had to admit, the kind of question she would have asked herself, and she felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes waiting for her answer, waiting to see if she would deflect or defend or break under the pressure. "Ask him yourself," Elena said, gesturing to the mezzanine above. "He is here." Every camera in the lobby swung upward in unison, lenses focusing on Lucian, who stood motionless against the railing, and Elena watched him make a choice, watched him calculate the political cost and decide he did not care, watched him move with that inhuman speed that made him blur and then solidify at her side, standing beside her at the podium, in full view of every camera, every reporter, every person watching this live stream around the world. The visual was striking, even Elena could see that. Ancient predator in his expensive suit beside an exhausted young mother in clothing she had owned since before Mia was born. Power and vulnerability standing together, and she heard the collective intake of breath from the reporters, felt the moment crystallize into something that would be replayed and analyzed and debated for months to come. "I bought this company because I am a king," Lucian said, his voice carrying that particular resonance that made people listen without knowing why, the authority of centuries compressed into simple words. "And a king's first duty, older than your laws, older than the council, is to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Ms. Torres could not. So I did. If that is a crime, charge me." Then he did something Elena had not expected, something that made her breath catch and her heart stutter. He knelt in front of her, in front of the cameras, in front of the entire world, dropping to one knee with his head bowed in an ancient gesture that transcended modern understanding, but somehow everyone recognized as significant, as binding, as irrevocable. Gasps rippled through the crowd of reporters, louder gasps from the handful of vampires present, and Elena saw Seraphine Cole standing at the back of the lobby, gold eyes wide with something that looked like shock or admiration or fury, her expression shifting through emotions too quickly to read. A king kneeling to a subject, Elena understood somehow, meant protection that could not be withdrawn. A public declaration that predated council law, predated treaties, predated everything modern vampires had built to regulate their relationships with humans. Lucian had just weaponized the old laws against the council, had declared her under royal protection in a way that made her untouchable without challenging his sovereignty, and the political brilliance of it took Elena's breath away, even as she understood the personal cost, the way he had just painted a target on his own back to shield her. Seraphine moved through the crowd with that predator grace, every reporter instinctively stepping aside to let her pass. And when she reached the podium, she looked down at Lucian still kneeling and smiled, slow and dangerous, and almost impressed. "Clever, Lord Thorne," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent lobby. "Very clever." She turned and walked out without another word, and Elena knew they had won this round, but the war was far from over, knew the council would retaliate, knew they had just made everything infinitely more complicated. Lucian stood and looked at her, his eyes asking a question she could not answer in front of cameras, and she nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude, and something else she was not ready to name. The press conference ended in chaos, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, security moving to clear the lobby, and Elena and Lucian stood together in the center of it all, united and exposed, and absolutely committed to whatever came next. That night, Richard Kendrick watched the press conference on his laptop in his tiny apartment in Alaska, drunk on cheap whiskey because expensive whiskey was beyond his maxed-out credit cards, and fury burned through him hotter than the alcohol, brighter than the northern lights visible through his frost-covered window. He saw Elena standing at that podium, saw her confidence, saw her surrounded by evidence of success while he scrubbed vampire floors at 3 in the morning, and something in him snapped completely, the last thread of restraint severing with an almost audible crack. He bought a plane ticket he could not afford, flew back to the city on fumes and rage, and stormed into Technova's lobby at 2 in the morning, with security immediately moving to intercept him, their hands on his arms, their voices calm and professional. But he screamed Elena's name over and over until his throat was raw, until the sound echoed through the empty building, until she heard. She was still in her office, working late because she was always working late now, proving herself endlessly. And when she heard Richard screaming in the lobby below, something in her chest went tight with dread and inevitability, the knowledge that this confrontation had been coming since the moment Lucienne had bought the company. Against her better judgment, against every instinct telling her to stay away, she took the elevator down to the lobby where Richard stood restrained by 2 security guards, his face red and twisted, spit flying as he shouted. The lobby was all glass walls and marble floors, nowhere to hide, security hovering at the edges ready to intervene, and Elena walked toward Richard with her spine straight and her hands steady at her sides. "You ruined my life!" Richard screamed, the words slurring together. "I gave you a job, and you repaid me by fucking a vampire." The crudeness of it, the vulgarity, was meant to shame her, but Elena felt only cold contempt, looking at this man who had once had power over her, and now had nothing, not even dignity. "You did not give me anything," she said, her voice calm and clear. "I earned my position. And you tried to take it because I am a mother. That is on you." Richard lunged, not to hit her, but to grab at her phone in her hand, trying to smash it or destroy something of hers, some petty revenge that would make him feel powerful again. But security tackled him before he got close, slamming him to the marble floor with professional efficiency. Lucian arrived between one breath and the next, vampire speed making him blur into existence between Richard and Elena, and she had not heard him coming, had not known he was in the building. But suddenly he was there, and his presence was violence barely leashed, was threat made manifest, was every predator instinct focused on the man who had dared threaten what was his. "Leave," Lucienne said, his voice dropping to that register that promised death. "Now, or I will forget every law that protects you from me." Richard should have stayed quiet, should have accepted escape, but rage and alcohol made him stupid, made him cruel one last time. "She is using you," he spat, struggling against the security guards holding him. "Can you not see? She is just a—" But he did not finish because Lucienne's hand was around his throat, not squeezing but there, cold fingers against fragile human skin, Richard's pulse hammering against his palm like a trapped bird. Elena saw Lucian's eyes go completely black, saw the predator emerge fully, saw him start to squeeze, and she knew with absolute certainty that he would kill Richard right here, right now, would snap his neck and face whatever consequences came after, and she could not let that happen. "Lucienne," she said, her voice cutting through the red haze of his rage. "Let him go." It was a test, she knew. A question about whether he could hear her when the monster was out, whether her voice mattered more than his instincts, whether protection could stop before it became possession. Lucien froze, his hand still around Richard's throat, his entire body rigid with the effort of control, And then he released Richard and stepped back, his movements jerky and wrong, fighting himself with every increment of distance. Security dragged Richard toward the door, and Lucian did not watch, staring instead at his own hand with an expression of disgust and horror. "I almost killed him," he said quietly, "for insulting you." Elena stepped closer, close enough to touch, and laid her hand briefly on his arm, the contact grounding and deliberate. "But you did not," she said, "because I asked you not to. That is the difference between protection and possession." The next morning, Seraphine Cole summoned them to council chambers, a converted church in the old part of the city where stained glass windows filtered sunlight into colors that could not hurt vampire skin, where ancient stone walls held centuries of secrets and judgments. Elena and Lucien stood before the full council, 7 vampires arranged in a semicircle like judges, Cassandra Vex among them, with her expression severe and unyielding, and Seraphine at the center with her gold eyes missing nothing. "Lord Thorn," Seraphine said, her voice formal and cold, "you have invoked droit royal, royal protection. This law was abolished in 1823. The council does not recognize it." Lucien stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture military and unyielding. "The council has no authority to abolish laws older than its existence," he said, each word precise and deliberate. "Droit royal predates Montreal, predates even the Treaty of Versailles. I am within my rights." Cassandra Vex leaned forward, her ancient face showing the first crack of real anger. "Perhaps," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass, "but you have set a precedent. Every elder vampire will now claim they can protect humans under ancient law. We will have thrall harems again, hidden behind legal loopholes." The accusation hung in the air, and Elena felt her frustration boil over, felt the unfairness of being reduced to a symbol, a problem, a precedent rather than a person. "I am not a harem," she said, her voice ringing through the stone chamber. "I am a VP. Can you not see the difference?" Seraphine looked at her for a long moment, gold eyes measuring and weighing, and then she smiled that dangerous smile. "Then prove it," she said. "Renounce his protection. Work for a competitor. Show the world you are not bound to him." The trap was perfect and obvious. If Elena refused, she validated the council's fears, proved she was dependent, proved she could not survive without Lucian's protection. But if she accepted, she lost his legal shield, lost her job, lost possibly everything she had built, and the council knew it, was counting on her fear to make her refuse. Elena felt Lucian go rigid beside her, felt him preparing to argue, to refuse on her behalf, and she made her decision in the space between heartbeats. "I will do it," Elena said clearly, watching Seraphine's eyebrows rise fractionally. "On one condition. Lord Thorn does not interfere. At all. No calls, no meetings, no checking in. For 3 months. If I succeed on my own, the council admits I was never thralled. If I fail," she turned to look at Lucian, saw the agony in his face, saw him understanding what she was asking and hating it, "then maybe you were right." Lucian turned to her, his voice low and desperate. "Elena, no. You are asking me to abandon." But she cut him off, her voice firm. "I am asking you to trust me." The words landed like a blow, and she saw him flinch, saw him understand that this was about more than the council, more than politics. This was about whether they could have anything real between them, or whether he would always be her savior, and she would always be his redemption, locked in roles that would eventually destroy them both. Seraphine looked between them and nodded, satisfaction clear in her expression. "Done," she said. "Ms. Torres, you are released from Thorn Eternal Holdings effective immediately. You are barred from Lord Thorn's properties. He is barred from contacting you. If he breaks this," she looked at Lucien with absolute seriousness, "the council will bind him for a century." The sentence was final, no room for negotiation. And Elena turned and walked toward the chamber doors without looking back, her spine straight and her hands trembling, trusting that this was the right choice, even as everything in her screamed to turn around, to take it back, to accept his protection and damn the consequences. Lucian stayed where he was, watching her go, and Seraphine moved to stand beside him, her voice pitched low enough that only vampire ears could hear. "If you love her," she whispered, "you will let her prove she does not need you. If you do not, you will destroy her trying to save her." Elena heard it anyway. Human ears catching the words through some accident of acoustics, and she pushed through the heavy wooden doors into sunlight that felt too bright, too harsh, stepping into a future she would have to build entirely alone, wondering if she had just made the bravest decision of her life or the most catastrophic mistake. 3 days after walking out of the council chambers, Elena sat in a corner office at Meridian Corp, Technova's biggest competitor, with a contract on the desk in front of her that she had negotiated entirely on her own. No vampire connections, no favors called in, just her resume and her work product, and a phone interview that had turned into an in-person meeting that had turned into an offer. VP of Employee Relations, better title than she'd had at Technova, same salary. And she had found it herself by sending applications to every major tech company in the city until someone responded. Her new boss was Vanessa Chen, human, mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair cut in a severe bob and eyes that missed nothing. No nonsense in a way that felt refreshing after weeks of vampire politics and council machinations. Vanessa sat across from Elena on that first day and laid out expectations with brutal clarity. "I do not care about the vampire drama," she said, her voice flat and businesslike. "I care if you can restructure our parental leave policy and cut turnover by 15%. Can you?" Elena met her eyes and said yes. One word, no explanation or justification, and Vanessa nodded and handed her a stack of files. "Then get to work." Elena did, throwing herself into the job with the kind of focus that came from needing distraction, needing purpose, needing to prove to herself and the council and everyone watching that she could succeed without Lucian's protection or influence. She restructured policies, interviewed employees, analyzed data, worked 12-hour days, and then came home to Mia and the small apartment that felt emptier than it should, quiet in ways that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. She missed Lucian. Not romantically, not yet. Though she was starting to suspect that feeling was coming whether she wanted it or not. But she missed his presence. The way he listened when she talked. The way he understood loss in a way most people couldn't. The way he made her feel safe without making her feel small. She was alone again. Truly alone in a way she hadn't been since that first night in the hospital, and the weight of it pressed on her chest like water, drowning slow. At night she held Mia, who was now 4 months old and getting heavier, developing personality, grabbing at Elena's face with tiny, determined hands, and Elena whispered questions into the darkness of their bedroom. "Did I do the right thing?" Mia just grabbed her finger and held on, her grip surprisingly strong for something so small, and Elena decided that was answer enough, that trust and holding on were all anyone could offer in the face of uncertainty. Across the city in a penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of a building he owned, Lucian stood at floor-to-ceiling windows watching the city lights and fighting the urge to break the council's edict, to call Elena, to check if she was safe, to hear her voice just once. He had not fed properly in a week, subsisting on blood bags that tasted like plastic and preservation chemicals, joyless sustenance that did nothing for the hunger that was as much emotional as physical. Isadora found him there at 3 in the morning, still dressed in the suit he'd worn to a business meeting 8 hours earlier. And her expression shifted from professional concern to something sharper, more personal. "You are spiraling," she said without preamble, crossing the penthouse to stand beside him at the windows. Lucien did not look at her, keeping his eyes on the city where somewhere Elena was sleeping or working, or taking care of Mia, going about her life without him. "I gave my word," he said, his voice rough with disuse. I will not contact her. Isadora was quiet for a moment. 600 years of friendship, giving her the right to push where others would not dare. The council said you cannot contact her, she said carefully. They said nothing about her contacting you. Lucian turned to look at her then, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. Do not, he started. But Isadora held up a hand. I am not suggesting you manipulate her into breaking the edict. I am suggesting you have faith that if she needs you, she will reach out. And when she does, you will be ready. Lucian turned back to the windows without answering, but Isadora saw his shoulders relax fractionally, saw him accept the possibility that this separation might not be permanent, that Elena might choose him rather than being bound to him. And she left him there watching the city, like a sentry keeping vigil over something precious and far away. Week 5 of the separation found Elena walking to her car in the Meridian Corp parking garage at 8 in the evening, exhausted from another long day, thinking about the presentation she had to give tomorrow, about Mia's 4-month checkup scheduled for Friday, about the grocery shopping she still needed to do. Mundane thoughts that made her feel almost normal until she heard footsteps behind her, quick and deliberate, and turned to see a man approaching with wild eyes and clenched fists. You are her, he said, his voice shaking with rage or fear or both. The vampire's whore. Elena's blood went cold, her hand fumbling for her phone, her keys, anything that might serve as a weapon, and the man kept coming, kept talking, words spilling out like vomit. You let him touch you, pollute you, betray your own species for money and protection and whatever else he gives you. Elena understood in that moment that he had been radicalized, found by one of those online forums where anti-vampire hate groups recruited and inflamed and pointed their members at targets, and she was a target now, visible and vulnerable. The human woman who had chosen a vampire's protection over human solidarity. She ran, turning on her heel and sprinting toward the garage exit. But he was faster, his hand closing around her arm with bruising force, yanking her backward, and she screamed, the sound echoing off concrete walls, security too far away to hear, panic spiking through her bloodstream like poison as she thought of Mia at home with a sitter, thought about what would happen to her daughter if this man killed her here in this parking garage, thought about never seeing her baby again. A figure dropped from the ceiling beams with impossible grace, landing between Elena and her attacker, and Isadora Thorne's ice-blonde hair caught the fluorescent light as she disarmed the man in 2 efficient moves, twisting his wrist until he dropped the knife Elena hadn't seen him holding, pinning him to the concrete floor with one knee on his spine. Ms. Torres, Isadora said, her voice perfectly calm. Are you hurt? Elena stared at her, shock and confusion and relief warring in her chest. What are you doing here? Isadora kept her knee on the attacker's back, pulling zip ties from somewhere and securing his hands with professional efficiency. Lord Thorne assigned me to watch you, she said, meeting Elena's eyes. From a distance. He is not breaking the council's edict. I am. The distinction was thin and probably wouldn't satisfy the council, but Elena couldn't bring herself to care, couldn't bring herself to be angry about protection when she had just nearly been killed. The man on the ground started talking, words tumbling out in a confession that sounded rehearsed, practiced, like he had been waiting for someone to ask. I was hired, he said, his voice muffled against concrete, paid to scare her, hurt her, make the vampire king watch his pet human suffer, not by Richard Kendrick, he's broke, bankrupt, but by others, vampires who call themselves purists, who think Lord Thorne protecting a human makes him weak, makes him vulnerable, a king who can be manipulated through maternal instinct and old guilt. They want her dead to teach him a lesson, to remind him that humans are temporary and caring about them is a mistake that ends in grief. Isadora pulled out her phone and dialed, putting it on speaker, and Lucien's voice came through tight with controlled fury that made the air feel colder. How many? He asked. No greeting, no preamble, just immediate tactical assessment. Isadora looked down at the man beneath her knee. Cell of 6, she said. They know where she lives. Elena heard Lucien's sharp intake of breath, heard the sound of something breaking in the background, and then his voice came again, harder and more dangerous. Get her to the safe house, he said. Now. I do not care what the council. But Elena grabbed the phone from Isadora's hand, her voice cutting through his orders. No, she said firmly, I will not hide. That is what they want. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, and then Lucien said her name, just Elena. One word that carried 400 years of loss and current desperation. She closed her eyes, pressed the phone closer to her ear. I am not hiding, she repeated. But I am not stupid either. What do you need me to do? Isadora took the phone back, started coordinating with Lucien in shorthand that Elena couldn't follow. Tactical language developed over centuries of working together, and 15 minutes later, Elena and Mia were in an armored car, heading to a secured apartment that was technically Thorn property, but registered under so many shell corporations that the council would need weeks to trace the ownership. Elena was furious, sitting in the back seat with Mia's car seat strapped beside her daughter sleeping peacefully while Elena's world spun out of control again. I told him I did not need protection, she said, her voice sharp with anger and fear. Isadora, driving with inhuman precision through city traffic, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. You do not need a vampire king playing White Knight, she said bluntly. You do need a tactical team stopping fanatics from firebombing your home. There is a difference. The words hit Elena like cold water, clarity cutting through her anger. And she realized Isadora was right, that she had been so focused on proving her independence that she had forgotten the threats were real, that ideology and principle meant nothing if she was dead. Where is he? Elena asked quietly. Lucien, where is he? Isadora's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Hunting the purest cell, she said, alone. Against council orders, because killing vampires, even rogue ones, requires council approval, and Lucien does not have it, will not wait for it, cannot wait for it knowing they know where you live. Elena sat very still, processing this, understanding what it meant that Lucien was breaking council law for her, understanding the cost he would pay, the punishment that would come, and she made a choice that was probably reckless and possibly suicidal, but felt absolutely right. Take me to him, she said. Isadora's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, surprise flickering across her ancient face. The council will call that contact, she said. You will both be punished. Elena looked down at Mia sleeping in her car seat, so small and innocent and completely dependent on Elena making the right choices, and then looked back up at Isadora. Then we will be punished, she said, together. Isadora smiled, slow and approving, and changed direction without another word, the car turning down streets that got progressively darker and emptier, heading toward the warehouse district where old buildings stood abandoned, and humans did not go after dark. She called ahead, brief conversation in a language Elena did not recognize, coordinating with someone, and then they were pulling up outside a massive warehouse with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls, and Isadora was handing Elena a phone. Call your sitter, she said. Tell her you will be late. Keep Mia in the car. Locks are reinforced. Nothing gets through them. Elena did as instructed, making the call, settling Mia who was still sleeping, and then she followed Isadora into the warehouse, where the smell of blood and violence hit her like a physical blow. Lucien was in the center of the space, facing 3 purest vampires who circled him like wolves, and Elena could see he was injured, his suit torn, blood staining the fabric in places that meant silver weapons, vampire blades designed to hurt their own kind. And he was winning, but barely. His movements still precise but slower than they should be, fatigue or injury dragging at him. Elena walked forward, her footsteps loud on the concrete floor, and every vampire in the warehouse stopped and turned to look at her, predator eyes reflecting light. And Lucien's face went through a series of expressions too fast to read, shock and horror and relief and anger all compressed into 1 second. Lucien, she said, her voice carrying across the space. Enough! He stared at her, blood on his hands, his eyes still black with combat rage. You should not be here, he said, his voice rough. The council. Elena walked closer, ignoring the three purest vampires who watched her with expressions of calculation and hunger. Can punish me later, she interrupted. Right now you are hurt, and we are ending this together. She turned to face the purest vampires, her heart hammering, but her voice steady. You wanted to kill me to prove he is weak, she said, looking at each of them in turn. But he is not weak, he is restrained. That is harder. She focused on the leader, tall vampire with scars across his face and contempt in his eyes. Your move, she said. Attack a human under royal protection, or walk away and tell your masters it is over. The vampires looked at each other, looked at Lucian, who was injured but still standing, still protecting, still absolutely willing to die before letting them touch Elena, and they chose survival, melting into shadows and disappearing with that vampire speed that made them blur and vanish. Lucian stood for one more second, swaying slightly, and then his legs gave out and he collapsed, dead weight falling forward, and Elena caught him, or tried to, his body heavy enough to drag her down with him, and she ended up on her knees on the concrete floor with his head in her lap, blood soaking into her skirt, his eyes fluttering closed. I have got you, she said, her hand on his face, her voice breaking. I have got you. Seraphine Cole stepped from the shadows where she had been watching the entire time. Gold eyes assessing the scene with an expression Elena could not read. You contacted him, she said, her voice neutral. The deal is void. Elena looked up at her, still cradling Lucian's head, blood on her hands and defiance in her eyes. I know, she said clearly. I do not care. Seraphine smiled, dangerous and genuine. Good, she said. Because neither do I. Council chambers at dawn, the converted church filled with pale light filtering through stained glass windows that painted the stone floor in colors of blood and gold and sapphire. Elena and Lucian standing before the full council with Seraphine beside them like a witness or advocate or judge. 7 ancient vampires arranged in their semicircle of power, representing continents and centuries of vampire law. The council chair sat at the center. A vampire so old his name had been lost to history, replaced by titles in languages that no longer existed. Eastern European features and eyes that had seen empires rise and fall, nearly 2,000 years compressed into a body that looked perhaps 60, white hair and lined face, and an expression of infinite patience. The charges were read by Cassandra Vex, her voice formal and precise, each word a nail in a coffin being built around them. Lord Thorne violated the non-contact edict, she said. Ms. Torres willfully engaged him despite knowing the consequences. Both are subject to binding. The word binding hung in the air like a death sentence. Vampire prison that could last decades or centuries. A punishment that involved silver chains and isolation and madness for creatures who had already lived too long. Cassandra continued, building her case with the skill of someone who had prosecuted thousands of violations over 1,200 years. This is why we ban protection bonds, she said, looking directly at Lucian. They override reason. Lord Thorne risked his seat on this council for one human. The contempt in her voice was subtle but unmistakable, the implication that Elena was not worth the cost, that no human could be worth the cost, that Lucian had failed in his duty to his own kind by caring about someone temporary and fragile. Elena felt anger rise in her chest, hot and clean, burning away fear and replacing it with clarity. He risked it because the council's rules do not account for actual threats, she said, her voice carrying across the stone chamber. The purists targeted me because of your edict. You created the danger, then forbade him from stopping it. She saw several council members shift in their seats, uncomfortable acknowledgement that she had a point, that their laws had unintended consequences, that perfection in regulation was impossible when dealing with creatures as old and complicated as vampires. Lucien spoke then, his voice measured and calm despite the stakes. "I have served this council for 200 years," he said, "enforced your laws, built your economy, negotiated treaties, but I will not apologize for protecting an innocent." The defiance was quiet but absolute, a line drawn that he would not cross, and Elena saw the council chair's eyes narrow slightly, assessing whether this was rebellion or principle, whether Lucien could still be trusted to serve council interests, or whether his attachment to Elena had made him unreliable. Seraphine stepped forward, her gold eyes bright in the dawn light, and her voice when she spoke carried the weight of 1,500 years of observation. "The law exists to prevent obsession," she said, looking at each council member in turn. "But I have watched them for 2 months. She does not obey him. He does not control her. This is not thrall binding. It is," she paused, searching for the right word, "something else." The council chair leaned forward, his ancient face showing interest for the first time. He looked at Elena directly, his gaze heavy enough to make her knees want to buckle, and asked the question that everything else had been building toward. "Do you love him?" The question was simple and impossible, intimate and political, and Elena felt every pair of eyes in the chamber focus on her, waiting for her answer, ready to judge her honesty. "I do not know," she said, refusing to lie, refusing to simplify what was complicated. "I respect him. I trust him. I understand him. Love? Maybe. But it is mine to figure out, not yours to regulate." The last sentence came out harder than she intended, defiant, and she saw Cassandra's expression darken with disapproval. But the council chair smiled, a slight curve of lips that transformed his severe face into something almost warm. "In my time," he said, his voice carrying an accent that predated modern languages, "we called this serce stelka, a heart compact. Rare. Not thrall, not romance. Partnership. The council cannot forbid it." Cassandra stood, her protest immediate and sharp. "But the precedent," she started, and the council chair silenced her with a gesture, one raised hand that carried absolute authority. "The precedent is clear," he said. "If a vampire and human choose alliance freely, we observe, we do not obstruct. Provided," he turned his attention fully to Lucien, "you accept permanent council oversight, monthly reviews, any sign of compulsion, and she is removed, permanently." Lucien inclined his head, the gesture formal and binding. "Agreed," he said simply. Elena felt relief start to bloom in her chest, felt the tension of the last 2 months begin to ease, but she was not done, had one more thing to ask, one more demand to make, while she had the council's attention. "And I want legal protection codified," she said, her voice steady. "Not just for me, for all human employees of vampire companies. Real HR standards, real oversight." The council chair looked at her with something that might have been amusement or respect or both. "You bargain with the council?" he asked. Bold. Elena met his eyes without flinching. "I am a VP," she said. "It is my job." The chair laughed, an unexpected sound that echoed off stone walls, and several council members shifted uncomfortably at hearing their leader express such human emotion. "Granted," he said. "You will serve as the first human council liaison. Your task is to draft and enforce human vampire workplace protections across all council-regulated territories." He turned to Lucien. "Your penalty is 50 years of council probation. Any violation of our laws, any sign that your attachment to Ms. Torres compromises your judgment, and you will be stripped of your territories and bound. Do you accept?" Lucien accepted without hesitation, and Elena understood that 50 years was nothing to someone who had lived 873, barely a moment, easily survived. But the probation meant they would be watched constantly, meant their relationship would be scrutinized and judged and regulated in ways that would make privacy almost impossible. The council chair delivered the final ruling with the weight of absolute law. You may not be together publicly. A romantic relationship would trigger compulsion fears, would undermine the precedent we are setting today. You are allies, colleagues, friends, nothing more. For now. The last two words carried the implication of possibility, of future change, but also of years or decades of waiting, of restraint, of loving someone in secret while the world watched and judged. 6 months later, Elena sat in her office at Technova, back in the building where everything had started, though her role was different now. Transformed from senior VP to council liaison with authority that crossed company boundaries and vampire territories. And she was good at this work, better than anyone had expected, drafting workplace protection laws that actually protected, enforcing standards that vampires fought against and humans desperately needed. She had revolutionized vampire-human workplace law across 47 companies in 6 months, created frameworks for parental leave and harassment prevention and pay equity. And Mia was healthy, walking now, babbling in that proto-language toddlers spoke, everything developmental milestone perfectly normal, the heart murmur resolved without surgery, just as the doctors had hoped. Lucian kept his word, attending monthly council meetings, submitting to reviews, maintaining professional distance that looked effortless, but Elena knew cost him everything. She could see it in the way his hands clenched when she walked into a room, the way his eyes followed her when he thought no one was watching, the pride in his expression when she presented her work to the council and they could not find fault with it. They did not touch, did not meet alone, existed in each other's orbits like planets that could not risk collision, and the restraint ached in ways Elena had not anticipated, a constant low-level pain that she learned to live with the way people learn to live with chronic injuries. She would catch his scent in a hallway, that particular combination of cold stone and old paper, and something indefinably him, and her chest would tighten with wanting, with missing him, with frustration at laws that regulated feelings as if emotions could be controlled by edict. Mia's first word was not mama or dada, but Lush, her toddler attempt at Lucien, because he had visited once early on, some council-approved check-in that had turned into him sitting on Elena's living room floor, while Mia grabbed his finger with both tiny hands and he had gone absolutely still, his expression transforming into something soft and broken and healing all at once. Elena decided to push the boundaries of what the council allowed, inviting Lucien to Mia's first birthday party with carefully neutral language. The council cannot object to a colleague attending a child's birthday, she wrote in the email, professional and distant, and he responded with equally careful formality, I would be honored to attend. And on the day of the party, he arrived at her apartment with a gift wrapped in paper that looked handmade, centuries old, and when Mia tore it open with enthusiastic destruction, Elena saw an antique music box, wood and silver and delicate mechanisms. And when Lucien wound it, the melody that emerged was heartbreaking in its beauty, a lullaby from another era, another life. Marguerite sang this to Isabeau, he said quietly, watching Mia's face light up with delight. I want Mia to have it. He was trusting Elena with his grief, with the most painful pieces of his history, and she understood the gift was not really for Mia, but for her, an offering of vulnerability, of trust, of everything he could not say out loud with council oversight hanging over them like a sword. Mia laughed and reached for Lucien with both arms, the universal toddler demand to be picked up, and he looked at Elena for permission, silent question in his eyes, and she nodded, her throat tight with emotion she could not name. He picked Mia up with infinite care, as if she were made of light or air or something too precious to risk breaking, and Elena watched her daughter settle against his chest like she belonged there, watched Lucien's face transform into an expression of such profound tenderness that Elena had to look away, had to press her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. After Mia was asleep in her crib, exhausted from birthday celebration and sugar, Elena and Lucian sat on her tiny balcony that overlooked the city, lights spreading in every direction, the night air cool and clean, and the silence between them was comfortable and terrible, full of everything they could not say. "I should go," Lucien said finally, the words reflexive, automatic, what he always said. "You always should," Elena replied, looking at the city instead of at him. "You never do." "Because leaving you is the hardest thing I do," he said, his voice raw with honesty. "Every time." Elena turned to face him, her decision made in the space between heartbeats. Consequences be damned. "I lied to the council," she said. "I do know if I love you. I do. But I am terrified of what that means." Lucien went very still, the kind of stillness only vampires could achieve, not breathing, not moving, barely existing. "I am terrified you will die," he said quietly. "Humans do. And I will be alone again. For centuries." Elena reached out and took his hand, skin against skin, warm against cold, alive against undead, and felt him shudder at the contact. "Then we have now," she said, "however long that is." She leaned in and kissed him, gentle and tentative, tasting snow and night and something ancient and indefinable, and for 1 second he did not respond, frozen with surprise or fear or restraint. And then he kissed her back, careful and controlled, one hand coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that made her want to cry. And they stayed like that for a handful of heartbeats before he pulled away, breathing hard even though he did not need to breathe. "The council," he started, and Elena cut him off. "Screw the council," she said firmly. "This is ours. They cannot regulate how I feel. They cannot control who I love. They can watch and judge and threaten, but this," she gestured between them, "this belongs to us." Lucien looked at her with an expression that was equal parts devotion and terror, and he nodded, accepting her declaration even as they both understood the cost, the scrutiny that would come, the fight they were choosing. They sat together on the balcony until dawn threatened, until he had to leave or risk burning, and when he kissed her goodbye, it felt like a promise, like a beginning, like the first page of a story that would be theirs to write regardless of what ancient laws said about appropriate boundaries between species. 1 year later, Elena stood before the International Vampire Council in Geneva, a gathering that happened once every decade. Representatives from every major vampire territory in the world assembled in a chamber that made the regional council look small. And she presented her proposal for the first human vampire family protection law, guaranteeing legal rights to mixed families, to partnerships between vampires and humans who chose each other despite the complications, to children born or raised in those partnerships who deserved protection under both human and vampire law. The stakes were absolute. If the law passed, she and Lucien could be public, could stop hiding their relationship behind professional distance and carefully neutral language, could simply be together without council oversight, dissecting every interaction for signs of compulsion. But if it failed, they would stay hidden, would continue the exhausting performance of restraint that was slowly killing something vital in both of them. The debate lasted 4 hours. Vampires arguing about precedent and tradition, and the dangers of allowing humans too much influence in vampire affairs. And Elena answered every question with data and case studies and the kind of calm professionalism that she had learned working for Vanessa Chen, refusing to be emotional or defensive, simply presenting facts and letting them speak for themselves. The vote, when it finally came, was 4-3, passing by the narrowest possible margin. And Elena felt her knees go weak with relief, felt tears press at the backs of her eyes, felt the weight of the last year lift off her shoulders like someone had removed physical chains. Lucien was in the gallery watching, had traveled to Geneva but could not participate in the vote because of his probation, and when the results were announced, their eyes met across the chamber. And he did not smile because he was a king, and decorum mattered even in victory. But his hand went to his heart in an old gesture that she had learned meant, "You have it, always," A declaration older than language, older than law, older than everything that had tried to keep them apart. 6 months after Geneva, Elena came home to her apartment to find Lucian and Mia on the living room floor surrounded by finger paints, her 2-year-old daughter absolutely delighted with teaching a vampire king how to make art, and Lucian was covered in purple paint, his expensive shirt ruined, his hair sticking up in directions that would have horrified Isadora, and he was laughing, actually laughing, a sound Elena had rarely heard, and she stood in the doorway watching them, thinking about that break room sink where she had cried 6 months pregnant and alone, thinking about Richard's cruelty, thinking about how impossibly far she had come from that moment to this one. "What are you thinking?" Lucian asked, looking up and catching her watching them, and Elena smiled. "That I should have cried louder," she said, "so you would hear me sooner." Lucian stood, leaving Mia to destroy another piece of paper with enthusiastic purple handprints, and he crossed to Elena with paint-stained hands and kissed her forehead. "I heard you the first time," he said quietly. "I will hear you for the rest of your life." It was a promise, and Vampire King's promises were blood-sworn, binding, eternal. And Elena leaned into him, accepting that promise and everything it meant. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out to see a message from Seraphine. "Congratulations on the Geneva victory. We need to talk. There is a vampire in Tokyo claiming protection rights over 30 humans. He says you set the precedent. Fix this." Elena showed Lucian the message and smiled. "Duty calls," she said. "Together?" he asked, and she nodded. "Always." They stood in the doorway watching Mia paint, the three of them vampire and human and child, messy and laughing and alive, and through the window behind them, the city spread out in lights and shadows. And somewhere in that city, another mother was crying at a break room sink. Another person was being crushed under power. They could not fight, and Elena was already planning how to help them, how to use the laws she had written, and the precedent she had set to make sure no one else had to choose between dignity and survival. And Lucian would be beside her for all of it, for as long as her human life lasted, and perhaps beyond, bound by something deeper than law, stronger than fear, a heart compact that no council could regulate or diminish or destroy.